Hello, my friend, and welcome to the Sleepy Scholar. Tonight, we are not going to visit knights in shining armor or castles glowing gold in the sunset or brave queens on tall horses. Tonight, we are going somewhere quieter and stranger than that, into the actual, lived-in, breathed-in world of the Middle Ages. Not the version painted on tapestries. The real one. A world of cold stone and smoky rooms, of small kindnesses and strange fears, of people who worked from the moment the sky turned gray until it turned dark again, and who somehow, through all of it, still fell in love, still told jokes by the fire, still tucked their children in at night. It was a harder world than we remember, and tonight we'll wander gently through it. You may have had a long day today. Your mind might still be turning over emails or conversations or small worries that don't want to let go just yet. That's all right. You don't need to solve any of that right now. You don't need to think clearly or follow closely or remember a single thing you're about to hear. You came here to rest, not to study, and that is exactly what this is for. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight. No appointment waiting, no message to answer. Just this voice, low and slow, and the soft, distant world of the medieval past drifting past you like weather. If your eyes are heavy, let them close. If your mind wanders off entirely, that's more than fine, that's the whole point. And if these gentle journeys ever help you drift off, a quiet like or a subscribe helps other sleepy souls find their way here too. Just a small thing, and then we'll let it go. Let's begin by coming home to your body. Let your shoulders drop just slightly away from your ears. You don't have to think about doing it perfectly. Just soften the way a candle flame softens when the air goes still. Let your jaw loosen. Let your tongue rest heavy in your mouth. Let your hands go quiet wherever they are resting. With your next breath, let it come slower than the one before. Not forced, just slower. And the one after that, slower still, like a tide easing back from the shore. You don't need to remember anything I say tonight. You don't need to follow the thread if it slips away from you. Nothing here is a test, and no one is keeping score. If you fall asleep in the next 2 minutes, this will have worked perfectly. So let your mind drift, loose and unhurried, as we begin to wander into a colder, quieter century. Life expectancy in the Middle Ages is often misunderstood. People sometimes imagine medieval villagers dying of old age at 30, worn out and ancient by modern standards. That's not quite true. If a person survived childhood, and that was the hard part, they might easily live into their 60s or 70s. But the average number gets pulled down dramatically by something much sadder. Nearly half of all children didn't make it to age 5. Fevers, infections, bad water, and diseases we now cure with a single pill in an afternoon could end a small life within days. So a medieval village didn't feel like a place full of the old and wise sitting quietly by the fire. It felt like a place with an enormous number of children, many of whom would not grow up, and a much smaller number of adults who had, in a very real sense, already survived the hardest part of being alive. If you are reading or listening to this tonight, you have already outlived the single most dangerous stretch of medieval life many times over, just by getting here safely tonight. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Medieval houses, for most people, were not made of stone. They were made of wood, mud, straw, and whatever else was close at hand. A method called wattle and daub, where woven branches were packed with a mixture of clay, dung, and straw, and left to dry hard. It worked. It kept out wind and rain mostly. But it also meant that an entire home, along with everything inside it, could burn to the ground in minutes if a single spark from the hearth landed wrong. Because of this, towns burned constantly. Not occasionally, constantly. A cooking fire left unattended, a lamp knocked over, a spark carried on wind through thatched roofs packed tightly together, and half a town could be ash by morning. There were no fire departments, no hydrants, no trucks. There were buckets and neighbors and prayer. People slept every night in homes made of the same materials that fueled their cooking fires, a few feet away, trusting the night to be gentle with them. But that is only one small part of the story. Inside those homes, especially before chimneys became common, smoke didn't rise neatly up and out. It curled through the room and found its way out through a hole in the roof, or sometimes just through the thatch itself, slowly, unwillingly. Families sat and worked and ate in rooms that were, by our standards, thick with haze. Over years, this took a real toll: reddened eyes, coughing, damaged lungs. Smoke was such a permanent fixture of daily indoor life that some historians believe it quietly shortened lives across entire generations, in a way nobody at the time could have named or understood. They simply thought of it as how a home smelled, how a home felt on the eyes at the end of a long evening. Tonight, your room is quiet, and the air you're breathing is simply air. That, too, is a kind of luxury the medieval evening never had. There is something gentler and a little sadder worth mentioning here. Toothache was one of the most common forms of daily suffering in the medieval world, and there was very little real relief for it. Sugar was rare and expensive, so cavities from sweets weren't the main issue. But poor diet, gritty stone-ground bread full of tiny bits of grinding stone, and simple lack of dental care wore teeth down badly over a lifetime. When a tooth became unbearable, there was no dentist waiting with careful tools and gentle numbing gel. There was often a barber, the same person who cut hair and performed minor surgery, who would pull the offending tooth with pliers quickly and without anything resembling modern anesthesia beyond perhaps a strong drink or a numbing herb, if you were lucky enough to have one nearby. Dental pain was so ordinary that people simply lived alongside it. The way we might live alongside a headache, we've decided isn't worth mentioning. It was just part of being a person in that century, in that body. There is something else worth resting on, something about water. Plain water, especially in towns and cities, was often not trustworthy to drink. Wells sat close to waste pits. Rivers carried both drinking water and the runoff from everything upstream. People understood, even without knowing about germs, that water could make you sick, so instead, they drank weak beer. Not the strong stuff meant for evening enjoyment, but a thin, low-alcohol brew called small beer, safe because the brewing process had boiled and fermented away most of the danger. Children drank it. Elderly people drank it. It was, in a very real sense, simply what a glass of water was for most of the medieval day. It's a strange thing to imagine. A whole civilization quietly protecting itself from its own water, using the accidental chemistry of brewing, long before anyone understood exactly why it worked. But that is only one small part of the story. Medieval clothing, especially for the working poor, was heavy, itchy, and slow to dry. Wool was the most common fabric, warm, durable, and completely miserable when soaked through by rain or sweat, which happened often, given how much of medieval life took place outdoors, bent over fields. There was no elastic, no zippers, no easy way to adjust a garment through the day as the temperature shifted. Clothes were laced, tied, pinned, and layered, and washing them was a labor-intensive, occasional event rather than a daily habit, meaning the same wool tunic might be worn, slept in, worked in, and only occasionally washed for weeks at a time. And because wool holds onto moisture and warmth so well, it also made an excellent home for lice, fleas, and other small unwanted guests who traveled with their human hosts from morning labor to evening rest without much resistance at all. There is something else quieter about beds. For most medieval families, a single bed, often just a straw-filled mattress on a wooden frame, or sometimes just straw on the floor, was shared by the entire household. Parents, children, sometimes grandparents too, all together, partly out of necessity, but also because shared body heat was one of the only reliable sources of warmth through a long, dark winter. Privacy, in the way we think of it now, a room of one's own, quiet and separate, simply didn't exist for the vast majority of people. Life was communal by default, not by choice. You slept where the warmth was, and the warmth was wherever everyone else already was. There's something oddly touching in that, even now. A whole family curled together against the cold, sharing warmth because there was simply no other way to survive January. Soften for a moment and let's rest on something about the sky. Medieval farmers were completely at the mercy of the weather in a way that's hard for us to fully feel today. There was no forecast, no radar, no 5-day outlook. If the rains came too early or too late or too heavy, an entire year's harvest could fail. And there was no supermarket down the street to fall back on. A few bad growing seasons in a row could tip a whole region into famine. This happened devastatingly in the early 1300s, when years of relentless rain rotted crops in the fields across much of Europe, leading to what's now remembered as the Great Famine. A period so severe that some desperate stories from the time speak of families eating things never meant to be food. Every single meal for a medieval family carried within it the quiet, invisible relief that the sky had this year been kind enough to allow it. There's something else worth resting on about the ground itself. Roads, where they existed at all outside of old Roman roots, still lingering from centuries before, were often just packed dirt fine in summer, but transformed into thick, sucking mud by autumn rain. Travel by cart could mean hours to cover a distance. We'd drive in minutes, wheels sinking, horses straining, everyone soaked and exhausted long before arriving anywhere. And travel itself carried real danger beyond the mud. Bandits knew that the same roads merchants and travelers depended on were the perfect place to wait, especially in the quiet stretches between towns where no one could hear a call for help. Because of this, most people, most of the time, simply didn't travel far. Their whole world, their entire lived experience, might be the village they were born in, and a handful of nearby towns, and nothing more for their entire life. Let your breathing settle again for a moment. There's no need to hold onto any of this tightly. Just let it drift. There is something worth knowing about childbirth. For medieval women, childbirth was, statistically, one of the most dangerous events a person could go through, more dangerous in many ways than warfare was for men. Midwives carried real skill and experience, often passed down carefully through generations, but without modern hygiene, without antibiotics, and without any way to manage serious complications surgically. Childbirth claimed a significant number of women in the prime of their lives. Because of this, families tended to be large, partly as a kind of quiet insurance against child mortality, yes, but also against the real possibility that a mother might not survive to raise the children she already had. Every single successful birth in that world was genuinely something to be relieved and grateful for. In a way, modern medicine has gently allowed most of us to stop thinking about quite so urgently. There is something gentler and stranger about medicine itself. Medieval physicians didn't understand germs, viruses, or bacteria. Those ideas were still centuries away. Instead, illness was often explained through the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, believed to need careful balance for good health. If someone had a fever, doctors might conclude they had too much blood, and the treatment, quite seriously, would be bloodletting, deliberately cutting or applying leeches to remove some of it. It sounds almost unbearable to imagine now, but the intention behind it was completely sincere. Physicians were trying, with the tools and theories available to them, to genuinely help. They simply didn't yet have the centuries of careful observation that would eventually replace humor theory with something closer to the truth. It's a strange kind of comfort, in a way, to realize how much of medicine has always been people doing their very best with an incomplete map of the body. But that is only one small part of the story. Surgery, when absolutely necessary, was performed without modern anesthesia. There was alcohol, sometimes opium poppy extract if it could be found and afforded, and sometimes nothing at all beyond several strong assistants holding the patient still. Amputations, tooth extractions, the setting of badly broken bones. All of it happened while the patient remained fully, agonizingly conscious. Surgeons developed real speed and skill specifically because faster meant less suffering, and a surgeon's reputation could rest entirely on how quickly they could complete the worst moments of someone's life. It's worth pausing, just quietly, to notice how far medicine has traveled since then, how something as ordinary now as a dentist's numbing injection would have seemed to a medieval patient like an impossible kindness from another world entirely. There's something else worth resting on about smell. Medieval towns, especially larger ones, had a smell that modern visitors would find genuinely overwhelming. Waste disposal was primitive at best. Chamber pots were sometimes emptied directly out of windows into the street below, with only a shouted warning, if that, to passers-by. Butchers dumped animal waste nearby. Tanneries, which processed leather using substances that smelled distinctly unpleasant, operated openly in town. There were efforts at sanitation. Some towns had rules about where waste could go, and street cleaners of a kind. But the underlying reality of dense medieval town life was one that engaged the nose constantly, and rarely pleasantly. People adapted, the way people always do. It became simply the smell of being alive in a town in that century background, expected, unremarkable to those who had never known anything else. There is something quieter about light. Candles were expensive, made from tallow, which is rendered animal fat, or beeswax for those who could afford it, which most could not. A single evening of candlelight represented a real cost, so most medieval evenings, once the sun went down, simply went dark. This meant the rhythm of medieval life bent itself almost entirely around daylight. Work happened while the sun was up. Once it set, activity slowed to whatever could be managed by a small hearth fire or a single precious candle. And then, mostly, people went to sleep. There's something almost peaceful in that thought, even amid all the hardship. An entire world that simply had no choice but to rest when the sky went dark, night after night after night. Soften again for a moment. Let your hands rest heavier. There's nowhere else to be tonight. There is something worth knowing about the night itself, beyond the darkness. Without streetlights, without locks that felt truly secure, without reliable law enforcement patrolling after dark, medieval nights carried a real, constant undercurrent of fear, of wolves near the edges of villages, of bandits on the roads, of simply losing your way in a darkness so complete it's hard for most of us to even picture now. Many towns enforced a curfew marked by a bell, after which gates closed and people were expected to be inside. It wasn't just tradition. It was a genuine, practical response to a world where the night held real danger, and where safety meant, quite literally, being behind a wall before the bell finished ringing. Tonight, wherever you are, the dark outside your window is simply dark. It doesn't ask anything of you. That, too, is worth noticing gently before we drift onward. There is something else worth resting on about serfdom. For a large portion of the medieval population, especially early on, freedom of movement simply didn't exist in the way we take for granted. Serfs were legally bound to the land they worked, unable to leave without their lord's permission, obligated to farm his fields for a set number of days each week before they could even tend to their own small plot for their own family's survival. On top of that came a web of obligations, a portion of the harvest owed as rent, a tithe owed to the church, fees for using the Lord's mill to grind grain, fees for using his oven to bake bread. A serf's life was, in a very real sense, never entirely their own, shaped constantly by debts and duties owed to people far more powerful than themselves. It's a heavy thing to sit with, even briefly. How much of medieval daily labor was spent not building a life for oneself, but simply meeting obligations one hadn't chosen and couldn't refuse. There is something quieter about the harvest itself, worth pausing on. Without modern storage, refrigeration, or pest control, a surprising amount of a hard-won harvest could simply be lost after the fact, to mice, to mold, to damp granaries, to insects that found their way into stored grain, no matter how carefully it was kept. This meant that even a genuinely good growing season didn't guarantee a comfortable winter. Loss could happen quietly, in the dark of a storehouse, long after the relief of a successful harvest had already been celebrated. Families learned to plan around this uncertainty as best they could, but there was always an element of the unknown. a kind of low, constant background worry about whether what had been gathered would actually last until spring. There is something else, gentler, about bathing. Contrary to a popular modern myth, medieval people did bathe. Public bathhouses existed in many towns, and washing was understood to matter for both cleanliness and health. But bathing was far less frequent than it is today, often a weekly or occasional event rather than a daily one. And hot water for a full bath required significant effort to heat. Later in the medieval period, as certain diseases spread more easily in the warm, shared water of public bathhouses, many towns began closing them out of genuine fear, associating communal bathing with the spread of illness. Bathing, once a normal social event, slowly became something people trusted less and did even more rarely. It's a small human detail, a whole society trying its best to balance the comfort of cleanliness against the real fear of what shared water might be carrying, without ever having the tools to know for certain either way. Let your breathing slow again. You don't need to hold onto any of these details. Just let them pass through like clouds. There is something worth resting on about winter cold. Homes were heated by a single central hearth, sometimes with no chimney at all in earlier centuries, meaning heat didn't spread evenly through a home the way it does now. The area right by the fire might be almost too warm, while corners of the same room stayed bitterly cold. Windows, for those who had them at all, were rarely glazed with real glass. Glass was expensive and reserved mostly for churches and the wealthy. Most windows were small, covered with shutters, or fitted with thin, translucent animal horn or oiled cloth, letting in a little light, but very little real insulation. Winter, for most medieval families, meant simply enduring the cold as best one could. More clothing, more shared body warmth, more huddling close to a fire that could never quite reach every corner of the room. There is something else worth knowing about eyesight. Eyeglasses weren't invented until the late 1200s, and even then, they were rare, expensive, and available mostly to scholars, monks, and the wealthy. For most people whose eyesight naturally weakened with age, there was simply no correction available at all. This mattered enormously for work that depended on close, careful vision, fine needlework, detailed craftsmanship, and especially the painstaking work of monks copying manuscripts by hand, often by dim candlelight, straining their eyes for hours at a time in service of preserving texts for future generations. Many skilled workers simply had to slow down or stop entirely as their eyesight faded, with no simple pair of glasses waiting to extend their working years the way it so easily could today. There is something quieter about food itself, worth sitting with. For much of the year, especially in poorer households, the diet was heavily based on bread, pottage, a thick vegetable and grain stew, and whatever could be grown, foraged, or occasionally afforded from a nearby market. Meat was a luxury for most working families, saved for special occasions rather than eaten daily. Religious fasting requirements added another layer of difficulty. During Lent and on many other days throughout the year, meat and dairy were restricted entirely, replaced with fish when it could be afforded, or simply with less food overall when it couldn't. For a population already living close to the edge of enough, fasting requirements could turn an ordinary lean season into something considerably harder. Food, in the medieval world, was rarely simply pleasure. It was calculation and rationing, and hope that what had been stored would truly last. There is something else worth resting on about salt and spice. Before refrigeration, preserving meat and fish for the winter months relied heavily on salting, smoking, and drying. Methods that worked. But that also meant preserved food often carried a strong, sometimes unpleasant taste by the time it was eaten months later. This is part of why spices, when they could be afforded at all, were so deeply prized, not simply for flavor's own sake, but for their ability to mask the taste of food that had been sitting in storage far longer than any of us would find appetizing today. Spices traveled enormous distances through many hands at enormous cost, largely to solve this very ordinary, very human problem. A pinch of pepper in that world wasn't a small thing at all. It was, in its own quiet way, a genuine luxury. Soften again, just for a moment. Let your jaw loosen, let your breathing ease. There's nowhere else to be. There is something worth knowing about illness and understanding. Without any concept of bacteria or viruses, illness was often explained through what's called miasma theory, the belief that disease spread through bad air, particularly foul-smelling air rising from swamps, waste, or decay. It wasn't a foolish idea, given what people could observe. Illness often did seem to cluster in places that smelled the worst. This belief shaped real behavior. Windows sealed against night air believed to carry sickness. Pleasant-smelling herbs carried or burned to ward off disease. Entire medical practices built around avoiding bad smells, rather than the invisible microorganisms actually responsible. It's worth noticing gently how reasonable an incorrect idea can sound when it's the only explanation available. A reminder of how much of what we now know took centuries of patient, careful discovery to finally arrive at. There is something else heavier, worth mentioning quietly, about the plague. In the middle of the 1300s, a disease now known as the Black Death swept across Europe, carried, as we now understand, by fleas living on black rats that traveled easily along trade routes. At the time, no one understood the connection. They only understood that people were dying in enormous numbers with terrifying speed. In every town the sickness reached. Estimates suggest that somewhere between a third and half of Europe's entire population died within just a few years. Entire villages were emptied. Families that had been whole in the morning were sometimes gone by evening. It reshaped labor, land ownership, and daily life across the entire continent for generations afterward. It's almost impossible to fully picture that scale of loss now, and we won't try to hold it too tightly tonight. Just let it settle quietly as one more true thing about how hard that century could be, and how, even after all of it, life continued slowly forward. There is something gentler in response to that same story, worth knowing. Out of the horror of the plague came one of history's first real public health measures, the practice of quarantine. Venetian officials, observing that ships arriving from plague-affected areas seemed to bring the sickness with them, began requiring incoming ships to wait offshore for 40 days before anyone could disembark. 40, in the local language of the time, gives us the very word we still use today, quarantine. It was an imperfect, imprecise tool, built without any real understanding of how disease actually spread. But it represented something important. People trying, seriously and systematically, to protect each other, using only careful observation and hard-won experience. Even in the middle of devastating loss, people were already quietly building the earliest foundations of the public health systems that protect all of us now. There is something small and human worth resting on about work. For most medieval people, there was no concept of a weekend, no paid vacation, no real separation between work life and home life. Work began at first light and continued until the light was gone, 6 days a week, with Sunday set aside primarily for church and rest. Though even that rest often included necessary chores that simply couldn't wait. Children, too, worked from a young age, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. A family's survival often depended on every set of hands available, and childhood, as a protected, work-free period of life, is in many ways a much more modern invention than we tend to assume. There's something worth sitting within that. How recent, in the long span of human history, the idea of a restful weekend or a truly carefree childhood actually is. There is something else, quieter, about marriage. For much of the medieval period, especially among the peasantry, marriage was often arranged with practical concerns, land, labor, alliances between families, weighing far more heavily than romantic love, at least at the outset. Women, in particular, had very limited legal and economic independence, often moving directly from a father's authority to a husband's. This isn't to say love didn't exist within these marriages. Plenty of evidence suggests genuine affection grew between many medieval couples over shared decades of hardship and partnership. But the starting point was rarely a choice made freely and entirely on romantic grounds, the way we might imagine or hope for today. It's worth noticing gently how much has shifted in the structure of ordinary life, even in something as intimate and personal as choosing who to spend a life with. Let your breathing settle again. You don't need to carry any of this. Just let it pass softly, like water over stone. There is something worth knowing about punishment and law. Medieval justice could be swift and, by modern standards, quite harsh. Public punishments, stocks, pillories, whipping, and more were common, partly as punishment itself, and partly as a public deterrent meant to be witnessed by the whole community. In some cases, particularly in earlier centuries, disputes were settled through trial by ordeal, a practice based on the belief that divine intervention would reveal guilt or innocence, sometimes through tasks like holding a heated iron or being submerged in water, with the outcome interpreted as a sign from a higher power. It reflects a world where the tools for determining truth were limited, and where people reached, understandably, for whatever framework of fairness and order was available to them at the time, even when that framework looks, from our distance, deeply unsettling. There is something else softer, worth mentioning, about children specifically. Infant swaddling, wrapping a baby tightly in cloth, often for much of the day, was extremely common in medieval households, based on the belief that it helped limbs grow straight and kept infants calm and safe. From a modern perspective, we now understand the downsides more clearly, including restricted movement and, in some cases, health complications. But the intention, again, was tender. Parents were trying, with the knowledge available to them, to give their children the safest possible start in a world that offered so few guarantees of survival at all. It's easy, from centuries away, to critique old practices. It's harder, and perhaps more honest, to remember that they came from the same instinct to protect a child that every parent has always felt. There is something quieter still about grief. Given how common early death was in childbirth, in infancy, in illness, in the ordinary accidents of daily physical labor, medieval communities lived with grief far more constantly and visibly than most of us do today. Mourning rituals were well developed, church bells tolled for the dead, and communities gathered to support families through loss in ways that were deeply embedded into daily social life. This doesn't mean grief hurt any less. If anything, it may have hurt in a more constant, ongoing way, simply because loss touched nearly every family repeatedly across a lifetime. But it also meant that no one grieved entirely alone. The whole village understood, because the whole village had lived through some version of the same loss themselves. There is something worth resting on about the wealthy, briefly. It's worth remembering that even castles, so often imagined as glamorous and warm, were, in reality, cold, damp, and drafty for much of the year. Thick stone walls that kept out invading armies also kept in the cold, and heating a large stone hall with open fireplaces was a losing battle against winter, even for those with money and status. Nobility ate better, dressed in finer materials, and held real power over those beneath them. But they weren't shielded from many of the era's harshest realities. Disease, in particular, showed little regard for social rank, and childbirth remained dangerous for noblewomen just as it was for peasant women, regardless of how many servants or physicians stood nearby. Wealth softened medieval hardship. It didn't erase it. Let your body settle a little further into stillness. You've done nothing but listen tonight, and that has been more than enough. There is something quieter now, worth mentioning, about animals. For many medieval families, especially in rural areas, livestock didn't live in a separate barn far from the house. They often lived remarkably close, sometimes even sharing part of the same building, separated only by a low wall or simple partition. This wasn't neglect. It was practical warmth, since animals generated real heat that helped take the edge off a cold night, and it made protecting valuable livestock from theft or predators far easier. It meant that the smells, sounds, and constant presence of animals were simply woven into ordinary indoor life in a way that feels almost impossible to imagine now. Chickens underfoot, a cow's breathing audible through the night. The ordinary rhythms of animal life mixed inseparably with human ones. There is something else, small, worth pausing on, about footwear. Later medieval fashion, particularly among the wealthy, embraced extremely long, pointed shoes known as poulaines, sometimes stuffed to hold their exaggerated shape. While striking to look at, they were, predictably, terrible for actual walking, and some historical accounts even connect this fashion trend to an increase in foot problems like bunions among those who wore them regularly. It's a small, oddly relatable detail, a reminder that the impulse to suffer a little for fashion's sake is not remotely a modern invention, but something people have quietly chosen to do for a very, very long time. There is something worth knowing about literacy. For the vast majority of the medieval population, reading and writing simply weren't part of daily life. Literacy was concentrated mainly among clergy, some nobility, and a small merchant class that needed it for record keeping. Most people learned everything they needed to know through spoken instruction, apprenticeship, and observation, passed down carefully from one generation to the next. This meant that entire villages might rely on a single literate person, often a priest, for reading any official documents, letters, or important news that arrived from beyond the local area. Knowledge of the wider world came slowly, filtered through very few hands, arriving late and often incompletely. There is something else, quieter, worth resting on, about apprenticeship. Learning a trade in the medieval period usually meant becoming an apprentice to a master craftsman, often starting in childhood, living within the master's household, and working long hours in exchange for training, food, and shelter rather than wages. The relationship could be genuinely educational and caring, but it could also be strict, demanding, and occasionally harsh, depending entirely on the character of the master involved. There was little formal protection for an apprentice treated poorly. Success or hardship in these early working years depended heavily on luck, on which household a young person happened to be placed in, and what kind of person happened to be in charge of their training. There is something worth mentioning briefly about the poor and the disabled. Medieval society had no formal safety net in the way we understand it today. No broad government support systems for those unable to work due to age, disability, or misfortune. Care fell primarily to family, local charity, and the church, which did provide real, meaningful support through almshouses, hospitals, and organized giving, especially around religious holidays. But this support was inconsistent, and someone without family or a nearby charitable institution could fall through the cracks entirely, relying on begging or the goodwill of neighbors simply to survive. It was a world that could be capable of real communal kindness, and also one with very little structural protection for those who needed it most. Let everything soften again for a moment. Let your breathing come slow and easy, like a tide that has stopped rushing anywhere at all. There is something worth knowing about fear of the supernatural. Without scientific explanations for illness, crop failure, or sudden misfortune, medieval communities often turned to supernatural or religious explanations instead. Bad luck attributed to a curse, illness understood as divine punishment or the work of malevolent forces, unusual events interpreted as omens requiring careful, sometimes frightened, response. This wasn't ignorance so much as a very human attempt to make sense of an uncertain world, using every available tool, religious, spiritual, and communal. When you have no way to test or verify an explanation scientifically, meaning has to come from somewhere, and faith and folklore filled that space carefully for most people, most of the time. There is something quieter, worth resting on, about the church's role in daily rhythm. Beyond spiritual matters, the church shaped nearly every visible rhythm of medieval daily life. bells marking the hours of prayer that structured the working day, feast days, providing rare breaks from labor. The church building itself, often serving as the largest, most impressive structure most people would ever see or enter. For many, church wasn't a weekly obligation separate from daily life. It was deeply woven into it, marking time, community gathering, education, charity, and comfort all at once. In a world that offered relatively few other large, shared institutions to belong to. There is something else worth knowing about famine's harshest edge. During the very worst famine years, particularly the Great Famine of the early 1300s, historical records from the time include desperate, unverifiable rumors of people resorting to eating things never meant to be food: old leather, tree bark stripped and boiled. Even in the most extreme and disputed accounts, far worse than that. Historians debate how literally to take some of these darker stories, but the fact that they existed at all tells us something honest about how close to true desperation an ordinary bad harvest could bring an entire population. It's a heavy thing to sit with for even a moment, and we won't linger here long. Just let it rest quietly as one more piece of how fragile ordinary daily life could become, and how far removed most of us now are from that particular kind of fear. There is something gentler waiting on the other side of that, worth knowing. Even through famine, plague, war, and daily hardship, medieval communities were also full of genuine warmth. Village festivals with music and dancing, shared harvests celebrated together, storytelling around the fire that kept whole traditions and histories alive across generations without a single written word. People fell in love. They made each other laugh. They built friendships that lasted entire lifetimes, cared for aging parents, delighted in their children's small achievements, exactly the way people do now. Hardship was constant, but so quietly and persistently was ordinary human joy, refusing to be entirely erased by how difficult the century could be. There is something worth resting on now about time itself, gently. Without clocks in most homes, the medieval day was measured by the sun's position, the ringing of church bells, and the rhythm of tasks that needed doing, not by minutes and hours in the precise way we track time now. A day simply unfolded, task by task, light to dark, in a rhythm that modern life has largely left behind. There's something almost restful in imagining that kind of time slower, less exact, governed by the sky rather than a screen. Even amid everything difficult about that century, this one small piece of it holds a kind of quiet, unhurried peace that's worth carrying with you gently as we begin to come to a close. There is something else worth knowing about washing clothes. Without modern soap as we know it, medieval laundry often relied on lye made from wood ash, mixed with water, along with stale urine, which was actually valued for its ammonia content and its usefulness in loosening grease and stains from heavy fabric. Laundry was a physically demanding, often communal task, done at riverbanks or shared wash houses, requiring hours of scrubbing and pounding fabric against stone. It wasn't pleasant work by any account, but it was necessary, steady, and shared, women gathering together at the water's edge, turning a hard chore into one of the few regular social occasions where news, gossip, and quiet companionship could pass easily between neighbors. There is something worth resting on about waste in towns. Larger medieval towns did attempt organized sanitation, designated waste collection, rules against dumping refuse in certain streets, workers whose job was to cart waste away. But enforcement was inconsistent, and population density often outpaced whatever systems existed. Streets could still carry the mixed smell of animal waste, kitchen scraps, and worse, especially after rain, when everything loosened and ran together downhill. Some towns fined residents for improper dumping. Others simply gave up trying to fully manage it. Either way, walking through a medieval town center meant navigating not just cobblestones, but a genuinely unpredictable ground underfoot, in a way city dwellers today rarely have to think about at all. There is something quieter about pests indoors. Rats, mice, fleas, and bedbugs were near constant companions in medieval homes, regardless of how careful or clean a household tried to be. Straw bedding, thatched roofing, and food stored close at hand all created inviting conditions for small, persistent intruders that no amount of diligence could fully eliminate. Households developed their own quiet strategies, keeping cats specifically for their usefulness against rodents, changing straw bedding as often as they could manage, hanging certain herbs believed to discourage insects. None of it worked perfectly. Living alongside these small creatures was simply an accepted, unavoidable part of indoor life. One more thing endured rather than solved. There is something worth knowing about leprosy and isolation. Leprosy, though less common than many other medieval ailments, carried enormous social weight. Those affected were often required to leave their communities entirely, sometimes living in separate settlements called leper colonies or lazarettos, cut off from ordinary daily contact with the people they had once lived among. In some regions, those with leprosy were required to carry a bell or clapper, sounding it as they walked to warn others of their approach from a distance. It was, in its way, an early and rather blunt form of public health precaution, but it also meant profound, lasting loneliness for those affected. A life lived permanently at arm's length from everyone they had once known. There is something else, gentler, worth mentioning about honey and light. Beekeeping held real practical importance in medieval life, providing both honey, one of the only reliable sweeteners available, since refined sugar was rare and costly, and beeswax, prized for making cleaner burning, better smelling candles than the more common tallow. A household that kept bees had access to two small comforts most others didn't: a little sweetness in an otherwise plain diet, and a slightly gentler light to sit beside once the sun went down. Small comforts, hard-won, carefully guarded, and genuinely treasured. There is something worth resting on about mental and emotional distress, conditions we now understand and treat as mental illness were, in the medieval period, often poorly understood, sometimes attributed to imbalance of the humors, sometimes to spiritual or supernatural causes entirely beyond a person's control. Treatment varied enormously. Some communities responded with genuine, if imperfect, compassion and care. Others responded with fear, isolation, or harsh, poorly reasoned remedies. There was no framework resembling modern mental health support, no vocabulary for naming what someone might be quietly suffering through. People carried these burdens as best they could within families, within small communities, using whatever understanding and kindness was available to them at the time. There is something quieter about widowhood. Losing a spouse carried heavy practical consequences in medieval life, particularly for women, whose economic security was often deeply tied to a husband's status, land, or trade. A widow might inherit some property or rights, depending on local law and custom, but she could also find herself suddenly vulnerable, dependent on remarriage, family charity, or her own considerable resourcefulness to continue supporting herself and any children. Some widows managed remarkably well, running households, farms, or even trades independently with real skill and determination. Others faced genuine hardship. Either way, widowhood marked one of the more precarious turning points a medieval life could take, arriving suddenly and reshaping everything that came after it. There is something else worth knowing about forests and law. In many regions, particularly in areas designated as royal forest, ordinary peasants were legally forbidden from hunting game, gathering certain wood, or even letting livestock graze freely, regardless of how close these resources sat to their own homes, and however much they might have needed them. These restrictions protected hunting grounds for nobility, but they also meant that a hungry family could face serious punishment for taking food from land they had lived beside their entire lives. Poaching did happen anyway, quietly, out of necessity, carrying real risk of severe punishment if discovered. It's a small, telling detail about how thoroughly medieval law could prioritize the interests of the powerful over the basic needs of everyone else. There is something worth resting on about bells and warning. Bells served an enormous number of practical purposes in medieval daily life, beyond marking the hours of prayer, warning of fire, signaling curfew, calling people together for important announcements, even tolling in a distinct pattern to mark a death within the community. A whole village learned to listen closely, understanding within moments what a particular pattern of ringing meant for their day. It was, in its own way, an early shared communication system built entirely from sound, carrying meaning across distances no voice could reach, letting an entire community respond together to whatever news the bell was carrying. There is something else, softer, worth mentioning about graveyards. Given how frequently death visited medieval communities, churchyards and burial grounds filled quickly, often becoming considerably more crowded than modern cemeteries. Older remains were sometimes moved to make room for new burials, and mass graves became a grim necessity during especially severe outbreaks of plague or famine, when the usual careful rituals of individual burial simply couldn't keep pace with the number of dead. Even so, communities did what they could to honor their dead within the limits available to them, and the presence of the graveyard, right at the center of most villages beside the church, meant that death was never somewhere distant or hidden. It sat, quite literally, in the middle of daily life. There is something quieter still about long-distance news. Without telegraphs, telephones, or any rapid means of communication, news traveled only as fast as a person could carry it, by foot, by horse, occasionally by ship, arriving days, weeks, or sometimes months after the events it described had already happened and changed. A death, a royal decree, a distant battle's outcome. All of it moved slowly, filtered through whoever happened to be carrying word along the road. This meant that most people lived with a real and constant sense of distance from the wider world, their understanding of anything beyond their own region always a little delayed, a little uncertain, shaped by rumor as often as by verified fact. There is something else worth resting on about debt. Falling into debt in the medieval period could carry severe consequences, including, in some places and periods, imprisonment until the debt was somehow repaid. A genuinely difficult task to manage while sitting in a cell, unable to work. Debt could arise easily from a single bad harvest, an illness that prevented work, or simply the ordinary unpredictability of a hard, uncertain economy. There was little forgiveness built into the system for misfortune. A single stretch of bad luck could follow a family for years, shaping decisions and opportunities long after the original hardship had technically passed. There is something quieter about milling and monopoly. In many manners, peasants were legally required to have their grain ground at their lord's mill for a fee, rather than being permitted to grind it themselves at home using a simple hand quern. This gave millers, and the lords who controlled them, significant power over an absolutely essential part of daily survival, turning grain into usable flour. Resentment toward millers was widespread and well documented, partly because of these mandatory fees, and partly because dishonest millers occasionally skimmed a little extra flour for themselves during the grinding process. A small but deeply felt injustice layered onto an already difficult system of obligations. There is something worth knowing about scarcity of salt. Salt was essential for preserving food, for basic nutrition, for flavor in an otherwise plain diet. And in many regions, it had to be transported significant distances from coastal salt works or inland salt mines, making it costly and, in some places, heavily taxed by ruling authorities eager for reliable revenue. A poor harvest of salt, or a heavily taxed one, could ripple outward into every single preserved food a family depended on to survive the winter, making something as basic and essential as salt into a genuine point of both economic and physical vulnerability. There is something else, gentler, worth resting on about fairs. Amid all this hardship, seasonal fairs and markets offered real, welcome relief. Occasions where entire regions gathered together for trade, entertainment, food, and simple human connection outside the narrow rhythm of ordinary daily labor. Traveling merchants brought goods, and sometimes news, from far beyond the local area, along with performers, musicians, and storytellers. For many medieval people, a fair represented one of the few times they might see faces, goods, and ideas from truly outside their own small corner of the world. A brief, treasured window onto something larger than their everyday life allowed. There is something worth resting on about old age. For those who survived into genuine old age, and some certainly did, despite the era's harsh average life expectancy, daily physical labor didn't simply stop because the body had grown weaker. Without pensions or broad social support, elderly people often continued working in whatever capacity they could manage, relying heavily on family support to fill in whatever gap remained between their reduced strength and their continued needs. A family that could care well for its elderly members was fortunate. One that couldn't face genuinely difficult choices in a world with very few institutional safety nets standing ready to help. There is something quieter now, worth mentioning, about ink and books. Before the printing press arrived late in the medieval period, every single book was copied entirely by hand. a slow, painstaking process that made books extraordinarily expensive and rare. A single manuscript could take a monk many months, sometimes years, of careful, patient labor to complete. Because of this, most people in the medieval world would go their entire lives without ever personally owning a book, encountering written text mainly through church services, public readings, or occasional glimpses of documents handled by the very few who could read them at all. There is something else worth knowing about winter stores. Surviving winter depended heavily on what had been carefully preserved during the warmer months. Root vegetables stored in cool cellars, grain kept dry against rot and pests, meat salted or smoked well in advance. Every autumn carried a quiet, serious urgency, a race against the coming cold to make sure enough had been set aside. A family's entire winter comfort, and sometimes their survival, rested on decisions made carefully in the preceding months, with no way to simply run out and restock if the calculations turned out to be wrong. There is something worth knowing about clothing and class. In many regions, sumptuary laws dictated exactly what a person was allowed to wear based on their social rank. Certain colors, furs, and fabrics reserved only for nobility, with fines or punishment for anyone lower down the social ladder caught wearing something above their station. Clothing in this world wasn't just personal expression. It was a visible, enforced marker of exactly where a person stood. A peasant could work an entire lifetime and never legally be permitted to wear the simple velvet or fine dye that a noble child might wear without a second thought. Status in the medieval world was woven quite literally into the fabric people were allowed to touch. There is something quieter, worth resting on, about winter diet and health. By the end of a long winter, once stored vegetables and fruit had run low. Many medieval people experienced real vitamin deficiencies without understanding why. Scurvy caused by lack of vitamin C could appear as the cold months dragged on, bringing fatigue, bleeding gums, and slow healing, mysterious and frightening to those experiencing it, with no name for the cause. It would be centuries before anyone connected these late winter symptoms to something as simple as fresh fruit and vegetables. Until then, it was simply one more unexplained hardship that arrived quietly near the end of every long, hard season. There is something else worth knowing gently about spoiled grain. Occasionally, rye grain infected with a certain fungus could cause a condition now called ergotism, producing hallucinations, burning sensations, and severe illness in anyone who unknowingly ate bread made from the contaminated flour. At the time, outbreaks were often mistaken for divine punishment or mass affliction rather than simple crop contamination, and entire villages could be affected at once. Some historians even connect certain strange, unexplained outbreaks of compulsive, uncontrollable dancing recorded in medieval towns to this same contaminated grain. A genuinely eerie mystery born from something as ordinary as bread gone wrong in the field. There is something worth resting on about bridges and rivers. Crossing a river safely often meant paying a toll at a bridge controlled by a local lord or town. One more small cost layered onto an already difficult journey. Where no bridge existed, fording a river by cart or on foot carried real danger, especially after heavy rain swelled the water higher and faster than expected. Drowning was a far more common cause of death in the medieval period than we tend to imagine now, quietly claiming travelers, children playing too near the water's edge, and laborers crossing rivers as simply part of an ordinary day's work. There is something quieter about the sea. For coastal communities depending on fishing and trade, the sea offered both livelihood and constant risk. Ships were vulnerable to sudden storms, unreliable navigation without modern instruments, and along many trade routes, the very real danger of pirates waiting for a vulnerable, heavily loaded vessel to pass. A fishing family might wait anxiously through rough weather for a boat that simply didn't come back. With no radio, no rescue service, no way to know what had happened beyond the slow, aching passage of time, and the absence of a familiar sail on the horizon. There is something else worth knowing softly about the sky and fear. Comets, eclipses, and other unusual celestial events were often interpreted as dire omens in the medieval world, foretelling plague, famine, war, or the death of a ruler. Without any scientific framework for understanding these events as natural and predictable, an unexpected light in the night sky could genuinely unsettle an entire region for weeks. It's a gentle irony, in a way, that the same vast, ancient sky we find so calming and steady tonight once carried, for medieval eyes looking up, a very different kind of weight entirely. There is something quieter still about hospitals. Medieval hospitals, where they existed, functioned quite differently than we'd expect today. They were often run by religious orders and served more as places of comfort, shelter, and care for the poor, the elderly, and the dying, rather than places equipped to actually cure serious illness or perform advanced treatment. A stay in a medieval hospital meant kindness, warmth, and prayer, offered sincerely and generously, but rarely the kind of medical intervention that could reliably change the course of a serious illness, given how limited medical understanding still was at the time. There is something worth resting on about physicians and training. Formally trained physicians, educated at the handful of universities that taught medicine, were rare and expensive, available mostly to the wealthy in larger towns and cities. Most people, most of the time, relied instead on local knowledge, a skilled herbalist, an experienced midwife, a barber surgeon, or simply the accumulated wisdom of family members who had learned, through hard experience, what seemed to help. This local, informal medical knowledge, often held and passed down carefully by women in a household, deserves more credit than history has traditionally given it. Quiet expertise built from necessity, tested against real outcomes over many careful generations. There is something quieter about occupational danger. Many essential medieval trades carried real physical risk that workers simply accepted as part of the job. Blacksmiths worked constantly near open flame and hot metal. Miners descended into unstable, poorly lit tunnels. Tanners handled harsh chemicals that damaged skin and lungs over years of steady exposure. There was no workplace safety regulation, no compensation for injury beyond whatever a guild or community chose to offer. A serious workplace accident could end a person's ability to earn a living permanently, with very little support waiting on the other side of it. There is something worth knowing gently about young workers. Children in trade families often began working alongside parents from a very early age, learning skills gradually through direct participation rather than formal instruction. In the wool trade especially, children's smaller hands were valued for certain delicate tasks, meaning even very young children contributed real, necessary labor to a family's income. It reflects, again, just how differently childhood functioned in that world. Not a protected span of years set apart for play and learning alone, but an early and expected entry into the working rhythm that would define the rest of a person's life. There is something else, softer, worth resting on about soldiers. Common soldiers, often peasants called upon by their lords during times of conflict, received little training, minimal equipment compared to knights, and almost no support if they were wounded and sent home. Warfare could devastate the very farmland these same soldiers depended on for survival. Trampled by armies, burned deliberately to deny resources to an approaching enemy. A soldier who survived battle might return home only to find the fields he needed to feed his family already ruined, facing a new, quieter kind of hardship that followed just as heavily as the fighting itself had. There is something quieter now, worth knowing, about bread and unrest. Because bread formed such a central part of the medieval diet, its price and availability carried enormous weight in daily life. A poor harvest, a corrupt miller, or a sudden tax could push bread prices beyond what ordinary families could manage, occasionally sparking real unrest, protest, or even riot in towns pushed past their limit. Bread wasn't simply food. It was, in a very real sense, a measure of whether ordinary daily survival still felt possible, and its price could turn a quiet town restless almost overnight. There is something gentler, worth resting on near the end, about small omens, alongside the larger fears of plague and famine. Medieval daily life carried countless smaller superstitions, beliefs about certain birds, certain days, certain small signs believed to predict good or bad fortune ahead. These small rituals and cautions offered a quiet, if imperfect, sense of control over an uncertain world, a way of feeling slightly less at the mercy of forces no one could fully explain. There's something gently understandable in that impulse. Even now, the wish for some small, steady ritual to hold on to, when so much of what actually happens remains entirely outside anyone's control. There is something soft, worth resting on now, about the storytellers. In a world with so little written record for ordinary people, oral storytellers and traveling singers carried history forward instead. Ballads and tales passed voice to voice, preserving memory, humor, and warning long after the events themselves had faded. A single skilled storyteller might carry, quietly, the entire remembered history of a village within them. It's a gentle thought to rest on, near the end of tonight's journey. How much of what survived from that whole difficult, distant century came not from stone or parchment, but simply from one voice, low and steady, passing a story on to whoever was listening. There is something worth knowing quietly about hunger and rank. When famine struck, it rarely struck evenly. Wealthier households, with stored reserves and the means to buy scarce grain at rising prices, could weather a bad year with real hardship, but usually survival. Poorer families, already living close to the edge in ordinary times, had almost nothing to fall back on, meaning the same failed harvest could mean genuine starvation for one household and simple inconvenience for another, just a short walk away. This uneven weight of hardship wasn't hidden or subtle. Everyone in a medieval community could see plainly whose table stayed full and whose did not, season after difficult season. There is something softer, worth resting on, about newborns, given how fragile infant survival could be. Baptism was often performed very soon after birth, sometimes within hours, driven by a genuine, urgent fear that an unbaptized infant who died might be denied a peaceful place in the next life, according to the beliefs of the time. Midwives were even permitted, in cases of danger, to perform an emergency baptism themselves if a priest couldn't arrive in time. It's a tender, aching detail when you sit with it gently. How much love and fear could be folded into the very first hours of a tiny new life, in a world offering so few guarantees that life would continue. There is something quieter still about uncertain endings, with medical understanding of death still limited. Occasional fears arose about whether someone declared dead might, in rare cases, still be alive, a fear that shaped certain burial customs, like waiting periods before burial, or watching over a body carefully before its final rest. It reflected honest uncertainty, born from a genuine gap in medical knowledge, rather than mere superstition alone. These careful, cautious customs offered a small measure of comfort against an uncertainty that medicine, at the time, simply had no better way to resolve. There is something worth knowing about water gone wrong. Occasionally, a town's well or shared water source became contaminated, sometimes from nearby waste, sometimes from a source no one could identify at all, leading to sudden waves of illness moving through a community with no clear explanation. Without any understanding of the connection to the water itself, blame often fell elsewhere entirely, onto bad air, onto misfortune, onto whatever explanation felt most available at the time. It could take a long while, sometimes, for anyone to notice the pattern and quietly begin avoiding the well that seemed, somehow, to be making people sick. There is something quieter, worth resting on, about running away. For a serf legally bound to a lord's land, leaving without permission, carried real risk of punishment if caught and returned. In some places, however, custom held that a serf who escaped to a town and lived there undetected for a year and a day could gain their freedom. A small, hard-won loophole that offered a sliver of hope inside an otherwise rigid system. It's worth resting on for a moment. The quiet courage that must have taken walking away from everything familiar toward an uncertain town, carrying nothing but the hope of outlasting a single difficult year. There is something worth knowing gently about taxes layered upon taxes, beyond rent owed to a lord and tithes owed to the church. Medieval peasants often faced additional fees for using communal resources, the lord's oven, the lord's mill, sometimes even a toll simply for moving goods along a local road. Each fee was often small individually, but together they formed a steady, constant drain on whatever a family managed to produce or earn. It meant that very little of what a household worked so hard to create actually stayed fully theirs. A quiet, ongoing arithmetic of obligation sitting behind almost every task of the day. There is something softer, worth resting on, about walls. Town walls offered real protection during dangerous times, but maintaining them was expensive and labor-intensive, often requiring residents themselves to contribute labor or funds toward their upkeep. During a siege, civilians inside the walls faced the same starvation and disease risk as any defending soldier, sometimes trapped for weeks or months as supplies dwindled slowly toward nothing. Safety behind those walls was real but conditional, dependent entirely on how long the supplies inside could outlast whatever danger waited outside. There is something quieter still about ink. Ink used for writing and copying manuscripts was often made by hand from ingredients like oak galls, iron salts, and gum, a careful, somewhat costly process in itself. Combined with the expense of parchment, made from carefully prepared animal skin, writing anything down at all represented a real investment of both time and resources. This is part of why so much of medieval daily life left so little written trace behind. Not because it wasn't worth recording, but because recording anything at all was simply, genuinely expensive. There is something gentle, worth resting on near the very end, about missing teeth. There was no real equivalent to dentures or dental implants available to ordinary medieval people. Someone who lost teeth to decay, injury, or simple age typically lived the rest of their life without them, adjusting their diet to softer foods, adjusting their speech, adjusting, quietly, to one more small loss that modern dentistry would now so easily prevent or repair. It's a small human detail to rest on, one more quiet reminder of just how many ordinary discomforts an entire century simply had to live alongside, without any real remedy waiting nearby. There is something worth knowing softly about purgatory and worry. Religious belief in the medieval period included a strong sense that one's actions in life shaped a long, uncertain journey afterward, including time spent in purgatory before reaching final peace. This belief brought real comfort to many, but it also carried a quiet, ever-present weight, a background worry about whether a life, however carefully lived, had truly been good enough. Prayers for the dead, candles lit in their memory, and acts of charity performed on their behalf were all, in part, gentle attempts to ease that uncertain journey for a loved one who could no longer act for themselves. There is something quieter, worth resting on, about buying peace of mind. Later in the medieval period, the practice of granting indulgences, reducing the time believed to be spent in purgatory in exchange for donations, prayers, or good works, became increasingly common and eventually controversial. For many ordinary people, it offered a tangible, understandable way to ease deep spiritual anxiety in a world that otherwise offered very few certainties about what came next. Whatever we might think of the practice now, it clearly answered something real, a very human need for some concrete action against an entirely abstract, unresolvable fear. There is something gentle, worth resting on, about solitary work. Shepherds, often tending flocks alone across long, quiet stretches of countryside, lived a genuinely isolated working life, away from village company for days or weeks at a time, responsible for the flock's safety against weather, disease, and predators with little help nearby if something went wrong. It was solitary, watchful work, carried out in every season, in every kind of weather, by people who spent far more of their waking hours in the company of sheep and open sky than in the company of other people at all. There is something quieter still, worth knowing, about color and cost. Dyeing cloth in the medieval period involved substances that could be genuinely harsh on the hands and lungs of those who worked with them daily. Certain dyes required stale urine as a fixative. Others involved boiling vats of strong-smelling plant or mineral compounds for hours at a time. Skilled dyers produced beautiful, vivid colors, but the trade itself was physically demanding and far from pleasant to practice. The rich blues, reds, and golds seen in medieval clothing and tapestries came from hands that had spent long days steeped in far less beautiful conditions to produce them. There is something soft, worth resting on, about leaving the land during particularly hard famine years, or after plague had thinned a region's population and reshaped the demand for labor. Some peasants left the land they'd always known, moving toward towns in search of paid work, freedom from feudal obligation, or simply a chance at survival that their home village could no longer offer. It was a difficult, uncertain choice, leaving behind everything familiar for a town that carried its own risks and hardships. Over generations, gradually, these small individual choices helped quietly reshape the entire structure of medieval society, loosening, bit by careful bit, a system that had once seemed as permanent and unmovable as the land itself. There is something gentle, worth resting on, near the very end, about learning a trade. Entry into a skilled trade was often tightly controlled by guilds, requiring years of apprenticeship, then additional years as a journeyman working under other masters, before someone could finally become a master themselves, permitted to train apprentices of their own. It was a slow, carefully guarded path, protecting the quality and reputation of a trade, but also limiting how quickly anyone could improve their own circumstances. For those who completed it, guild membership offered real security and standing. For those who couldn't, women in many trades, or those without the resources to survive years of low-paid training, that same door simply stayed closed. There is something quiet, worth resting on, about the forest's edge, Beyond the cleared fields of a medieval village lay the forest, and it held a very different meaning then than it might now. It offered firewood, foraged food, and building material, yes, but it also represented the genuine unknown, a place where wolves still roamed in many regions, where a traveler could lose their way entirely, where wandering too far from the familiar paths carried real, practical risk rather than simple adventure. Children were taught early and firmly to respect that boundary, to understand exactly how far was safe to go, and where the safety of home and field quietly gave way to something far less certain. There is something soft, worth resting on, about children without parents. When plague, famine, or the simple dangers of daily life left a child without living parents, there was no formal foster system in the way we understand one today. Care typically fell to extended family, if any could be found nearby, or to the wider community, or, in the hardest cases, to whatever charity the local church could provide. Some orphaned children were taken in with real warmth and became fully part of a new household. Others faced a harder, more uncertain path, their future depending heavily on the simple, unpredictable kindness of whoever happened to be nearby when they needed it most. There is something quieter still, worth knowing, about metal and tools. Iron was valuable and not always easy to come by, meaning tools were repaired, sharpened, and maintained carefully rather than casually replaced the moment they wore down. A blacksmith's skill in mending a broken plow blade or a worn hoe mattered enormously to a farming family, since a full replacement might be far beyond what they could easily afford. This careful, patient relationship with tools, repairing rather than replacing, valuing what already existed rather than assuming more could simply be bought, shaped an entire relationship with material things quite different from the one most of us carry today. There is something gentle, worth resting on near the very end, about small gardens of healing. Many households, and especially monasteries, kept careful herb gardens, growing plants valued for their believed medicinal properties, passed down through generations of careful, patient observation. Chamomile for calming, certain roots for easing pain, particular leaves believed to help wounds heal more cleanly. This quiet, practical knowledge formed the backbone of most ordinary medical care, long before any of it could be explained scientifically. Much of what grew in those small, carefully tended garden beds has, remarkably, been studied since and found to hold real value. A quiet thread of genuine wisdom passed hand to hand through centuries, long before anyone could say precisely why it worked. There is something quiet, worth resting on, about the night watch. Many towns appointed watchmen to patrol the streets after curfew, calling out the hour, keeping an eye open for fire, for trouble, for anything unusual stirring in the dark. It was steady, unglamorous work, walking slow circuits through empty streets while everyone else slept, trusting their own alertness to be the town's quiet line of defense until morning. There's something almost gentle in imagining it now, a lone figure with a lantern, calling softly into the dark that all is well, so that everyone else could rest a little easier behind their shutters. There is something soft, worth resting on, about difficult winters for animals, when hay and stored feed ran short by late winter. Farmers sometimes faced the hard choice of culling part of their livestock, rather than watching the whole herd weaken from insufficient feed. Losing animals meant losing future milk, wool, and labor, but keeping too many through a lean winter risked losing them all instead. It was one more quiet calculation layered onto an already uncertain season, weighing present hunger against future need, with no easy answer waiting in either direction. There is something gentle, worth resting on near the very end, about quiet confession. Regular confession was an important part of religious life for many medieval people, offering a rare, private space to speak honestly about guilt, fear, or wrongdoing to someone bound to keep it confidential. In a world with little formal privacy and few outlets for emotional release, this quiet ritual may have offered something genuinely valuable. A place to simply be heard, without judgment carried forward into daily village life. It's worth resting on gently. This one small, protected space carved out of an otherwise very public existence, where a person could finally set something heavy down, if only for a few private, quiet minutes. There is something quiet, worth resting on, about mirrors. Glass mirrors of real clarity were rare and costly in the medieval world, meaning most people had only an imperfect sense of their own reflection, a still pool of water, a polished piece of metal, or nothing at all beyond how others described them. It's a strange thing to sit with gently for a moment. A whole century of people moving through life without the easy, constant self-checking a mirror offers so casually today. There's something almost restful in imagining that kind of life, in one small way, less time spent studying one's own reflection, more time simply moving forward through the day as it came. There is something soft, worth resting on near the very end, about burying the dead. Even a simple funeral carried real cost, a grave to be dug, a priest's fee, a shroud, or modest coffin if a family could manage one at all. For a poor household already stretched thin, an unexpected death could mean scraping together funds they could barely spare, on top of the grief itself, layering practical hardship directly over already heavy sorrow. Communities often stepped in where they could, neighbors offering small contributions, or shared labor to help ease that particular burden. One more quiet example of how survival in that world so often depended on people simply looking out for one another. Let your breathing slow further now. There's no need to hold onto anything we've spoken of tonight. There is one last quiet thought before we let this all go completely. Above you, right now, the same sky that stretched over every cold medieval winter, every frightened plague year, every small village fire, is still there, steady, ancient, entirely unconcerned with the particular century you happen to be resting beneath tonight. It has been unfolding for billions of years, and it will keep unfolding long after tonight, long after any of the worries currently living in your mind. Your mind, after all, is simply a prediction machine, quietly trying to make sense of everything that happened today, everything that might happen tomorrow. It doesn't need to finish that work right now. It's allowed to set it down gently and let this slow, steady voice carry it the rest of the way toward rest. You can let all of this soften into impression now. There's no need to remember the plague, or the poolings, or the pottage, or the smoke curling through a wattle and daub roof 800 years ago. Let it all blur together into something soft and formless, the way a whole day dissolves into a single, gentle feeling by the time you're finally lying still. Let your breathing come slower now, slower still. Let your body sink a little further into wherever it's resting. The day is loosening its grip on you, a little more with every breath. And far above you, calm and steady, the same old sky keeps turning, exactly as it always has, asking nothing of you at all tonight. Your body already knows how to rest. Sleep well, and good night.